Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre. What a respectable crowd for a wintry Melbourne night, but I hope you're only respectable in numbers and not in temperament. I want a rowdy crowd of Ruth Park fans who are rabid to talk about an author they love and to kind of harness an opportunity not to forget one of our literary greats in this country. And to show that you're rowdy, I want you to begin by making our two guests, Lili Wilkinson and Anne Phelan, very welcome. Please make them.
Thank you.
Now, I'll introduce these two in a moment, but I before that should mention that the third person on our bill for this evening, Marion Halligan, couldn't be with us because of a Chilean ash cloud, which frankly sounds like a pretty unrealistic explanation to me. We'll be having words. We're not terribly convinced. I'm Michael Williams. I'm head of programming here at the Wheeler Centre, and I will be your Muddle-Headed Wombat for the evening, trying to wend my way between these two Ruth Park aficionados. Now, there will be a chance for you to add your own thoughts and reminiscences and your own experiences with the work of Ruth Park through the night. Part of what fuels this series for us here at the Wheeler Centre is a conviction that we're not terribly good in Australia at remembering the people we love to read and remembering our literary heritage. Often they're out of print far too soon. They're certainly out of vogue or out of favour. So you'll get a chance. Microphones will come round. I'll drill you on it when we get there. You look like you're fairly quick on the uptake. But the first of our guests tonight is Lili Wilkinson. You may know Lili from one of her 7 books. Was it that we... Good, 7 books that she's had published. Lili was, in fact, first published at the age of 12. I mention that just because it's a biographical fact that I'm sure she'd prefer not to have brought up every time. And I'm contrary like that. She used to work at the State Library of Victoria in the Centre for Youth Literature. She's now doing a PhD at the University of Melbourne, and her latest book is called A Pocket Full of Eyes. Our other guest tonight is Anne Phelan, who I'm sure many of you recognise, both Ruth Park fans and anyone who's turned on a television in Australia pretty much in the past.
Not recently.
Recently enough. In the past 40 years. That's enough time to have turned on the television. Anne's been in shows from Prisoner to Neighbours and pretty much everything in between, including 4 years as Kate in Bellbird. Since joining Actors Equity in 1968, Anne's worked in all aspects of the industry and is a familiar face. She's recipient of 8 Best Actress Awards, including an AFI Award for Mumma and Poor Man's Orange, about which I'm sure we'll be hearing more tonight. She was voted the Variety Club TV Actress of the Year for her role in Harp in the South. Got 2 Television Society of Australia Awards for her role as Myra Desmond in Prisoner. She picked up her 2nd AFI Award for Mom Taylor in Something in the Air. The bio and the awards and the acclaim go on for some paragraphs, but I'll ask you to interrupt me at this point with applause for Anne Phelan.
Thank you.
Now, before we get to the conversation proper, I thought I would let Marion Halligan be here just kind of non-corporeally for a moment, and read an essay she wrote about Ruth Park, just a short part from the start of that essay, which I think captures a lot about Park. It was as part of a celebration that the National Library of Australia did of Park's work, and Halligan wrote, "One of the delights of reading Ruth Park's autobiographies is the insight they offer into her novels. The rat, for instance, that in Fishing in the Sticks sits on a windowsill, a composed, leisurely rat, murderous as Set, a kitten-eater. The sneering and frightening, but not otherwise harming rat we've already met in The Harp in the South, nibbling a baby. It is ferociously murdered by the child's mother, the young and once more pregnant Roe, but not before it has run up under her skirt and needed to be beaten off. When she dies in childbirth shortly afterwards, the reader remembers the rat and lives the horror of it all over again. That's what fiction does. It takes the events of the writer's life, lived through, heard of, read about, and turns them into powerful stories. It's a process that Ruth Park is aware of, has lived through many times, but never takes for granted, never pretends to understand." I thought I'd kick off, Lili, by asking you about your first discovery of Ruth Park as a reader, when you first came to her.
It bizarrely wasn't with the Muddle-Headed Wombat. I actually didn't read the Muddle-Headed Wombat until, shamefully, like 3 weeks ago. It was in grade 4 when my primary school librarian introduced us to the film of Playing Beattie Bow. And it was so incredibly atmospheric and creepy and strange and haunting that I immediately, after having finished it, ran to the shelf of the library and was the first there and managed to snag one of the copies of the book. And I would say that it had an extraordinarily profound effect on me, and I then went and read all of her other children's books, or sort of children's almost young adult books. And I think probably the nicest thing anyone has ever said about me as a writer was a review for my first book, Scatterheart, in The Age, where they said that there were not a lot of books for young people about Australian history that were of a similar calibre to Playing Beattie Bow, but that my book was one of them, and that's definitely the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. So, yeah.
That so far outstrips anything nice anyone's ever said to me that I'm embarrassed. We might come back a bit later to this kind of discussion about writing for younger people and the affinity Park had for it and the relationship between those skills and her skills writing for adults, because I think it's an area that we don't straddle that easily always in Australia. And I'm going to ask you the same question, but before that, I think we're going to just see a brief video clip that might...
Are we in the way?
Only slightly, and we'll move if we have to. The video is of us looking at a screen behind us.
It's very postmodern.
You won't be able to use that much longer. What do you mean? They've let the place. To take a leaf out of your young girl's book. You should have seen her getting stuck into the cops the other day when they raided my place. Somebody put me in. Got any ideas? Get in, maggot.
Oh, that is fantastic.
So long since I've seen it. So, yeah.
Was your first contact with the work of Ruth Park for a role? Was that the...
Yes, it was. I have a confession to make in this establishment, is that I'd never read Ruth Park until it was actually Lois Ramsey who played Mrs. Campion, and we were both in Prisoner together. And she'd seen something else that I'd done, playing a sort of, mum character as opposed to a murderer in Prisoner. And she said, "Do you know that they're making a series of The Harp in the South?" And I had to ask her what she meant. And I had heard the name Ruth Park, but I was completely ignorant of her writing. And in fact, this copy here is the book that Lois gave me to wish me luck for the audition, and it's also the one that Ruth Park has signed. And so it's very special. And yes, it was actually Lois that put me in touch with the fact that they were doing it. They were mainly casting in Sydney, and in fact when my agent rang the casting people and said Anne Phelan would like to screen test for Mumma, they went, "Oh, we never thought of her." And they flew me up, and eventually, months later, I got the gig. But yes, I read the book because of that, and interestingly enough, I then put the book away, because when you're doing an adaptation, you have to do the adaptation. And I'd fallen into the trap once before. I did Cabaret, the musical, played Sally Bowles when I was much younger in Cabaret, and I made the mistake of studying I Am a Camera and the other things that Cabaret had come from. And what you've got to realise is Cabaret is a 1950s musical. It is not I Am a Camera, it is not the others. And even though the adaptation, of course, of Harp and Poor Man's Orange were beautifully done, and Ruth had a say in that, she was one of the co-adapters of Harp with the others, you do have to be careful that you don't take the book onto set. I don't mean physically, but there are times when a script just can't do what a book can do. And you can't go in and go, well, I'm going to do the feeling that's in the book if it's not in the script. So it wasn't until actually 5 or 6 years after it went to air that I picked the book up again and read it. So yes, it was. It was auditioning for the role, and I read the other day. I was reading some stuff, and I thought this could be the cast of Harp in the South, but it's actually the cast of Cloud Street, and they say exactly the same things that we felt. Todd Lasance, who plays Quick Lamb in Cloud Street in the film. There is so much there. I wasn't aware of the book before the audition, but once I tested for it, before I walked in, I was so passionate about it already. The writing just blew my mind, and I thought, that's exactly how we all felt about Harp. He goes on to say, we all agreed that it's one of those moments that we will all look back on and be so grateful for. We all, crew as well, shared a deep passion for this project. And that was the other thing. Crews, film crews, and by that I also mean television crews, they've seen it all. They are probably the most cynical people in the world. And usually by the end of a 4-month or 5-month film shoot, which Harp, of course, was 4 to 5 months, they are ready to chuck it in and go anywhere, except they just wanted to go straight onto Poor Man's Orange. And when you've got a crew that actually says, well, can't we just go straight into Poor Man's Orange, you know you've got something of great integrity. And I think that was the beauty of the adaptation too, was that everyone realised that the writing, the foundations were there, was so beautiful. A lot of the cast always had the book on set. They would always refer to Ruth Park. So that's the way different people work differently. That love of the source material and that belief in the project must have been a bit of a double-edged sword, though. I mean, while the cast and crew had it, your viewers at home would have had it doubly so, a real sense of ownership over the material. Yes, and that can be scary.
Yeah. It was obviously incredibly well received. How much do you remember of that time, of that kind of those first responses?
Because it was in the 80s, mid-80s, which of course was the era of miniseries in Australian television. When you think of some of the extraordinary miniseries that were made in those days. And Channel 10 were actually the leading light at the time, and Channel 10 were very much behind Harp, and it hadn't even gone to air before they decided that, yes, they would back Poor Man's Orange. Yes, it is. So consequently, you go through that whole publicity thing. So, and then, of course, the press are getting copies. They've seen, so you start to get a feel that yes, this is being well received, and you do breathe a sigh of relief. I think we always, as they say for the Cloud Street interview, we always had tremendous faith in it. We knew from the first night of watching the day's filming from the day before, that we had something very, very special. And you can tell that. You can tell that whether it's theatre, television, film, you know from day one.
I don't think Ben Elton's crew had the same feel when the shows over. In their guts, they knew that was not. Yeah. You said Ruth Park was very involved in the making of it. Do you remember her being on set?
Came on set only once. I got the impression she was an extremely private person. We had wanted her to come on set. We were nervous, of course, about her being there, but we had the feeling, I certainly got the feeling that the reason she hadn't been on set was because she didn't want to interfere with what we were doing. She had given birth to this child and let it go, and it was up to us. I don't think she wanted to be seen as hovering and checking us out. But the day she came on set was the day we shot the radio contest where Dola is in the radio quiz, and she came on set on the condition that no publicity whatsoever be done about the fact that she was on set, and that we weren't allowed to be sort of telling anyone that she was on set, and we all respected that. And I must admit, at one point I did take a photo. to this day, and it's too late now because she's in writer's heaven, but I don't think she knows that it was sort of a crowd like this, and she was sitting amongst the extras in the audience of the radio station. And I pretended to be taking a photo of Dola. And I just moved the camera across like that. And I've got a photo of Ruth Park in the crowd, and I treasure that. But then once it went to air, I received an absolutely delightful letter from her. But I got the feeling she was a private person. I got the feeling she was actually possibly quite shy. But she certainly did not want to interfere with what we were doing. She certainly didn't want to be seen, as I said, hovering and checking that we were doing her things properly. She had let it go. She understood the whole filming process, that once it's out there, there is nothing that the author of the original book can do about it. It's too late.
And you were there with
Very
your camera,
gracious.
hidden camera, ready to catch it if she wasn't. Like the paparazzi. I'm a bit shocked. Lili, as a young reader coming across Park for the first time, do you remember, was there a moment where you crossed the threshold, where you devoured her writing that was specifically for young readers and you made the move through to her adult works? When did you read Harp in the South?
I would have read it as an older teenager, I think, probably either at the end of high school or the very beginning of university. And the thing that I found really incredible, and I still find incredible about her writing, is that everything, it doesn't matter what it's about, it doesn't matter whether it's about, the slums of Surry Hills or it's set on a Pacific island or whatever, it all has this incredible just kind of depth of feeling and language, but it's still very accessible. She's not a dense writer, and it is so incredibly, everything she writes is moving. And I was reading her first autobiography on the plane a couple of weeks ago and just kept bursting into tears, just because the writing is so, she makes you feel things that, there is a quote in one of her books that says, the thing about being a writer, the thing that you want to do when you're a writer is you want to make somebody think, oh, that thing, that part of my life was there all along, but you showed it to me. And she does that, and she's always done that.
I went to Sydney with my parents for the bicentennial year, and we went to Surry Hills for something, or through Surry Hills, and I remember being so disappointed by Surry Hills, because I had Park's Surry Hills in my head, and that was not, but she'd so created a place and a world that was completely alien to me. I mean, I'm a Melbourne boy, and it was just as her description of the rocks in Beattie Bow, or her sense of place was amazing. Like many truly great Australians, she was born in New Zealand, but she managed to capture something kind of fundamental about place that I think was extraordinary. I might, just in my role as Poor Man's Marion Halligan for tonight, I'm going to read a brief bit about Harp in the South from her essay. Park talks about, in the creative process, a sorcery in the subconscious. And Halligan goes on to say, this sorcery of Ruth Park's began its encircling some 50 years ago when she decided to enter the inaugural Sydney Morning Herald novel competition. She looked at her life, rejected most of it, particularly the New Zealand growing up, and decided there was nothing left but Surry Hills. Park said, my life there had been like a visit to some antique island where the 19th century still prevailed. The result was the Harp in the South. When it won, Ruth Park probably wished that she lived in a place where even the 19th century held some sway. So bizarrely primitive was the reaction. I remember the furor. It's one of those things I've always known about, known from adults in hushed, shocked, gleeful voices, talking about the scandal of this novel of the slums. What shocked me when I came to look at it again was the realisation that I was 6 at the time. It was clearly some scandal. That was in 1946. Ruth Park wonders what caused the outcry. John Cleary, the runner-up, wrote about the slums of Sydney without attracting any censure. Ruth Park suggests that it was because she was a foreigner. I think it might also have been because she was a woman, and young at that, not nice, not ladylike, to know about such things, let alone write them, and perhaps there was an assumption that slums might be seen but should not be heard. That furor by the 80s, when the TV show was made, was of course long gone, and it was a classic in its depiction of a place and a time. But how much did that inform your work putting together the TV show?
I was... I often say I had to do very little research as an actor for Harp and Poor Man's Orange. I was born in 1948 in Nicholson Street, Fitzroy. My parents rented a house right opposite the exhibition buildings. They had boarders, quite eccentric boarders, just like Hugh and Mumma had eccentric boarders. Fitzroy, of course, in those days was the slums. It was Melbourne's equivalent to Surry Hills, I now realise. It is now gentrified, as is Surry Hills in Sydney. But in those days, even I remember as a child, I wasn't allowed to go further down Brunswick Street, Gertrude Street past Brunswick Street, because past that was just, that's where the Deros, as we called them, were, and it was a bit dangerous, but I was allowed to do that block of Gertrude, Palmer, Nicholson. The eccentric characters in Harp and Orange were in Fitzroy in those days. The women, my mother, my aunties, the women of that era, of that area and that era, were the women out of these books. I grew up with them. So to me, I don't know what the furor was about, because I was surrounded by these people. You know, we all knew the local prostitute. We all knew, and of course we had Daniel Mannix, you know, the Archbishop, and he used to walk up and down, and we had these wonderful eccentric characters. My father was a policeman in the 30s. He used to drive John Wren to the races as a policeman, because when John Wren was allowed to go back on the track, they were worried that he might be assassinated, and they supplied him with a police driver, and that police driver was my father, because he was a driver with the police patrol cars. And Mum often said that it was John Wren's tip, not the racing tip, the actual money tip that he would give Dad on the return trip, that got them through some really bad times sometimes. So I was so lucky that, and it was interesting that a lot of the younger actors would come to me and go, what does this mean? And also I was Catholic, from Irish Catholic background. I mean, you know, it was all there. But it was the eccentricity of the neighbours, the boarders, the fact that Mum and Dad rented this house for 25 years and had boarders. I can remember, you know, Friday nights was always the drunk night, and that's when Mum would have me in bed with her, because our boarders would come home so drunk that they'd fall up the steps, and they were worried. She wasn't worried about any violence or anything, but mainly that they would trip over me, or I would trip over them, or if they'd fallen asleep on the steps going up to the first floor. So I was surrounded by these characters, so I was so lucky that this was just like reading about my family and my neighbours.
I wonder if that's one of the reasons why, first, why people love it, but also why people hated it, was because, I mean, you know, I grew up in Clifton Hill in the 1980s, which is very, very different. It wasn't as posh as it is now, but you know, we still had insane, crazy neighbours as well, and you know and she brings that kind of experience to life so much of growing up in an eccentric neighbourhood, that it feels so real, and the kind of, and I suppose also, in particular with Harp in the South, like, it is very bleak. You know, there are a lot of horrible things that happen, and even watching the miniseries over the past week, like, you know, it's a lot of it is very, very shocking. But I think that the way that she portrays it, firstly, it feels very, very real. But secondly, God, you really care about all those people, you know, even the horrible, abusive, alcoholic ones. Like, you still really, really care about them. And I think that it probably made people feel stuff that they were perhaps uncomfortable with feeling.
Or we weren't allowed to talk about, you know, don't mention him, you know.
I think it also in Australia isn't, or is too rarely, the domain of what we think of as literature. If you think about that kind of literary tradition in Australia, the historical is a big part of it, but also the rural is a big part of it.
Absolutely.
The urban narrative, and especially a kind of contemporary warts and all urban narrative, is something that we have a very uneasy relationship with in this country,
Absolutely.
I think.
Yeah.
And there's an extent to which, even though Park was a masterly writer of the historical, she also had such an acute ear for contemporary voice. And I think there's something in that.
I think too, I just wanted to mention that the number of people to this day who see the miniseries and now are buying it because there's a particular chain of shops right in around Australia that has the word hi-fi in it and 2 initials before it, and they've always got them in, and they're like $8.99, $9.99. So people are buying them all the time.
They've done it again. Sorry, I thought we were doing an ad.
Which is fabulous, but it never ceases to amaze me the number of people who have stopped me, especially I live in Romsey, so I all those people in the country that said, I went and bought that miniseries. They don't know it was a novel. They have never read it, but what they have done is gone out and bought the books. And that happened when the series came out. The number of people who then went, I didn't know this was a novel, I've never heard of Ruth Park, and they went to their library or they went and bought it. And I think the same thing's going to happen with Cloud Street. I think that the television series of Cloud Street is going to bring a whole lot of people to the books, and I think that's fabulous. I just think that's wonderful when we take these wonderful writers and it's done with great integrity and great love, as was Beattie Bow and these two, and Cloud Street, from what I can gather. I don't have pay TV, so I haven't seen it, but yeah, I think that's fabulous that it actually makes people go to a bookshop or a library and they discover something, and especially with Ruth Park, as you were saying, they discover these people that they can totally fall in love with, even no matter how awful that character might be. And I just think that's fabulous, that television can make people go out and buy a book. I think it's great.
I think the other thing that should be making people go out and buy a book is, you get a taste of Park's prose and you're hungry for more. As I say, I've stepped into the breach because Marion's not here tonight. So I was doing just a little bit of skimming through my old Ruth Parks in preparation, and honestly, I got nothing else done today. I pretended in the office that I did, but I was just absolutely consumed by beautiful, beautiful writing on the line. I think, Anne, because we're lucky enough to have you here, I'd love it if you would read maybe the passage from the start of Fishing in the Sticks.
Yes, this is
great.
the one that Marion was going to do, wasn't it?
Just so that everyone can, so that we can all take a moment to enjoy the incomparable voice of Ruth Park.
From my signed copy, I just wanted to
We will be watching you after the session. Do not
have
come
a little
and take
brag
this.
about that. Okay. One boiling day I was writing in my garret when the murderer knocked at the door below. I knew it was the murderer because I looked from the bedroom window of our landlady, Mrs. Cardy. Her window surveyed Devonshire Street and the rowdy world, whereas mine was slap bang up against the sweating wall of the Chinese grocery next door. As Mrs. Cardy was at church, I went downstairs to see what he wanted. But it was merely to inquire if my landlady could put a few stitches in the torn lining of his coat pocket. His demeanour was as circumspect as his knock had been modest. "Leave the coat with me, Mr. Green," I said, and we parted civilly. As he turned, I observed on the back of his head the rubbly dent where some friend had once cracked him with a hatchet. In Devonshire Street, Surry Hills, we were not short of murderers, no. We had Sweet Pea, a child strangler, a musty old rapist who had inexplicably slid by on a manslaughter charge, served his time and been freed, but still had bottles and hard words thrown at him. We had rabbity women who had done in their newborns but got off on a plea of insanity. In those days of the Second World War, it was still widely believed that women who had just delivered could reasonably be expected to be off their heads. "Yes, dear," these meek women said with a certain mournful importance, "I was out of me mind. Terrible, really. All me milk went to the brain. I suppose it curdles like." Being in a delicate condition at the time, though extraordinarily ignorant of the entire process, I plied my mother in New Zealand with nervous questions about these ladies with heads full of junket. "Have I reared a loony?" she asked testily. But you were saying how a lot of Ruth, of their actual life, she would then, like that wonderful phrase, slap bang up against the Chinese grocery. Well, of course, you know, we then have Mr. What's his name?
Lick Jimmy.
Lick Jimmy in Harp in the South, and the whole Chinese grocery thing, and the murder, and she brings these people alive.
I challenge anyone to read that and not want to keep reading.
Yeah. I kept going. I wanted to keep going. Yes.
Now, you'll notice at either side of the room we have a couple of excellent ushers holding microphones. If you have any contribution you'd like to make to the discussion, any questions, anything you'd like to add, just put your hand up. I'll completely fail to see you, so keep it up, and the microphone will come to you so that everyone else can hear it. But I was going to just come back to the thing that we were talking about earlier, Lili, about her writing for young people and what made her particularly good at that.
That's a very good question, and it's one I have been pondering, having just read A Fence Around the Cuckoo, her autobiography about her childhood. And I think partially it was because she was a very introspective child herself. She was quite solitary in her early childhood in sort of the North Island, one of the remote parts of the North Island of New Zealand. And she describes herself as growing up as a possum, that she spent a lot of her time alone in the rainforest, just quite happily exploring and making up stories, and that she always wanted to be a writer, and that's all she's ever wanted. And she had no books in her house, nothing to read other than the newspaper, but would write stories on the back of the kitchen door in chalk, because she had no paper either. Occasionally got some butcher's paper. And I think because that was what she wanted as a child. She used to write stories. She had them published in the New Zealand Herald as a child, and it just consumed her. It was something that, you know, every waking moment of her life was devoted to becoming a writer, even though, you know, she grew up in the most absolute crushing poverty, and it would have seemed like, you know, an incredible far-off dream for her. But so I think at the end of the day, it's because she has a massive amount of respect for young people and the things that young people can achieve. And I think that comes across in her writing. And good writing for young people is writing that respects young people and what they can achieve and what they can do and what they have to say. And I think in her books, she has a lot to say, and particularly in, I actually just reread My Sister Sif over the weekend, which was one of my favourites in about grade 6. And there's a lot to say in this, and a lot of it is scarily prescient.
Do you want to read a passage out of My Sister Sif? Because it stands up pretty well, I think.
Yeah, lovely cover by Elizabeth Honey. I just came across this session, which is at the very end of the book, and the book is set in the future, and it's set on a remote Pacific island, and it's a very ecological book. But she says this: "The world didn't end with a bang or anything dramatic and noisy. A little way into the 21st century, as though it were tired of the long battle against mankind, the earth began quietly to die, like a baby will when you have no real love for it. Rain patterns became wild. That was something to do with the damage to the upper atmosphere. After that came drought and its grey brother famine. Everyone who is young today will remember those times. During those years, many kinds of familiar creatures vanished forever. One day my niece Giselle said wonderingly, 'Do you really remember butterflies, Erica?' In the Pacific, all the bordering countries endured the megastorms. They spat out tornadoes and filled the dark skies with upside-down trees of lightning. The rain was like in that biblical flood. Continental coasts collapsed. Mountains fell in. Many islands and atolls were stripped right down to their coral bones. This book was written in the 80s. And it's creepy. But she does go on to talk about the solution that she finds, that she and her partner finds to save the world, is children, and is educating children, and is teaching children to love the planet and to respect, all of the living creatures. So, yeah.
There's an evil Tony Abbott character in that book too. It's quite surprising how accurate she gets it. It's unsettling. That thing you were saying about her drive, her writerly drive, is really extraordinary. I mean, we haven't talked at all about her marriage and about the fact that he was one of Australia's great literary power couples, to use a horrible phrase. But the way in which she and Darcy decided that they wanted to be writers, decided in a way that is almost unthinkable now, but it was equally unthinkable then, that to say, we just want to make a living out of our writing, that's it, we don't want distraction, I say they didn't want distraction, they had 5 children, but they so utterly gave themselves over to this task of making storytelling, making the writing life what was there for them, until he tragically died quite young, only 49. But there's her literary agent, Tim Curnow, said that she produced, in the decade from in the 50s, she produced some 5,000 radio scripts alone, as well as numerous articles to newspapers, magazines, bigger works of fiction. She just wrote and wrote and wrote.
I read somewhere that she and Darcy used to write 60,000 words a week, of which maybe 15,000 would be published. Yeah.
It is extraordinary, extraordinary commitment. I'd like to see anyone in this room with similar commitment to anything, apart from going out to events on wintry nights, because you're all clearly champions of that. Now, the offer for questions or comments still stands. We will keep talking until a hand goes up. That's a threat and a promise. But
one of my favourite... Oh, a hand's gone up. There you go.
A microphone's making its way into you now.
Are we on? Oh, good. I'm a Brit. I live here. But I've heard of Ruth Park. I haven't read her, but I've got some books in my bag. But I'd be interested if you could help me out. And is there anyone you could see as a parallel in another country, so the States or in the UK, who has the same impact that she seems to have had, or this sort of voice? Because when you were describing her description of, is it the Surry Hills?
Jimmy McGovern jumps into my brain straight away.
Okay. Yep.
Definitely.
Sorry, go on. Yeah,
definitely. A series like The Street has echoes of the way Park writes about community. Sorry, go on.
And I was basically this sort of sense of place as well, because I was thinking, well, is it going to be like Dickens, or it's not that kind of depth? It's more fast-moving, maybe.
Dickens is probably not a bad parallel, because I was trying to think of somebody who covered the kind of range of readers, because there are not many people who wrote so incredibly well and award-winningly well for for adults, young adults, children, and then the very young as well, which is pretty impressive. So I'm not sure I can think of anyone.
And this is probably, I might be a bit off the track, but I'm thinking Alan Bennett too, in the sense that he grasps those people that are so real, the way she does too. But when you ask that question, maybe because The Street is still so close, I've been watching it, and to me Jimmy McGovern sort of does those sort of people.
She's less grim, though. There's a real warmth to her. Anyone else in the audience should feel free to answer each other's questions. I was going to do a directive at the end of the session, not to just rush to the street to wait at a station for a train that's not going to come, but actually to take a moment to turn to someone you don't know in the room and exchange something you care about in the works of Ruth Park. This is how books survive. This is how authors survive, is something booksellers talk about as word of mouth. And you're clearly a room of zealots, so it's your job to kind of get word of mouth going. We have another question up the back.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Anna, And first of all, I want to say that I'm a little bit like you. I had never read Harp in the South or Poor Man's Orange until I saw the mini-series, and I was just blown away by your performance and all the other performances in the mini-series. I thought you were fantastic as Mumma Darcy. I still remember your pain with your bunions, your embarrassment when you were permed, and I sort of think my other favourite author is also Janet Frame from New Zealand, and I think Angel at My Table moved me and just touched me the same way as Harp in the South did. Thank you.
And interesting, a female New Zealand writer, New Zealand born, yeah.
Now,
another famous Australian.
There's a microphone coming to you from your right.
Hello, I'm Lynn. I came to Ruth fairly recently, but I also crossed with Eve Langley. Do people know Eve Langley, who wrote The Pea Pickers? And she crossed over from Ruth. She grew up in Victoria and went to New Zealand, and she died in Australia. But the book Wild Eve, which was about her with her young children in Auckland, was very sort of danced with Ruth Park, I thought.
Yeah.
Michael has a good story about another famous writer that crossed over with Ruth Park.
That's what I'm rummaging for when you say that, because it's a terrific tonight. Just on the other side of this wall right now, the Miles Franklin Award is being given. Park won it in 1977, but for the first time the Franklin's being given outside Sydney. It's here in the State Library of Victoria. And it's an award with a controversial and checkered history of its very own. But one of the controversies around this year's presentation is about the fact that it's the second time in 3 years that there's no woman on the shortlist for the award. And there seems to be something extraordinary in the fact that this is an award created by a bequest of one of the great women of Australian literature.
Who had to pretend to be a man in order to get published.
Had to pretend to be a man in order to get published. And yet it seems to have a particular gender bias, possibly. It's reasonable to say. But delighted to find this passage, again courtesy of Marianne Halligan, in Fishing in the Sticks, where Park talks about Miles Franklin. It was a bad, agitating time, full of conflicting currents. More than anything else, I was perturbed by the writer Miles Franklin's mysterious enmity. I can see her yet, slight little lady, spine ruler straight, rimless glasses, an ornamental hat set straight across a fine forehead, and still dark hair. A 70-ish woman to whom I was introduced at some literary bun fight. I was delighted to meet her, for although she'd published so little, she was and is one of the legendary figures of Australian literature. She responded to the introduction mutely. With a brisk nod of acknowledgement, she moved away. At that time, I did not know she was an unsuccessful entrant in the Sydney Morning Herald's novel competition. Still, not for a moment can I believe that disappointment could have been the only cause of her untiring hatred. There was something obsessional about it, for although she was openly and venomously defamatory about everything I wrote, my personal life, and even my appearance, it seems she continued to read my books, view or listen to my plays, even attend any function where I was speaking. Thus she fed her inexplicable ire for years. What was the reason for such an intelligent woman's capitulation to malice? Was I a symbol of something she detested, or something she had missed and lost? I sometimes think it might have been the latter, for although she was cruelly disparaging of most women writers, the only other person of whom I know, and whom she actively traduced for a long period, was the clever and charming 16-year-old Catherine Gaskin, whose first book was a bestseller and who went on to write many others. This darkness in Miss Franklin has not been adequately addressed by her biographers. The question remains why a person who was, in several ways, an exemplar of the old-fashioned virtues would indulge herself in so base a manner.
Do you reckon that maybe there's some kind of secret clause in, like, the Miles Franklin judging guidelines that, you know, be suspicious of women writers?
Yes, don't trust them. I don't know. There's a nice seamy underbelly to that. Love a literary feud. So that's worth remembering. But it does please me a bit to think about Franklin turning in her grave when Park won the award a few years later.
I actually didn't know that until she died. I didn't know she'd won a Miles Franklin. I suppose because I was always more in touch with what she'd written for younger people. But
she's one of only, I think I've got this right, shouldn't be saying it if I'm hazy. I think it's only 7 women have won the Miles Franklin in the 53 years it's been given. Several of them were repeat winners, but yeah, the hit rate's not great. And that thing about the historical versus the contemporary, the rural versus the urban is
and
definitely
also the
played
domestic.
out.
I think the domestic versus the grand.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something in that. And thinking about similar writers to Park, it's her capacity to tell grand human stories in a domestic milieu that make her, I think, worth going back to again and again. Now, we are perilously close to running out of time, and I'm mindful I'm just ranting here and you're all politely sitting on your hands. So this is your opportunity. We have a question here.
I know very little about Ruth Park, but I'm reading The Muddle-Headed Wombat, and I'd like to just hear you speak a bit about that, particularly what is the genius of that? Why has it lived so long and so well? Just some comments from
recreate it. Yeah, as I said, I only actually read The Muddle-Headed Wombat for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and last night I actually browbeat my partner in letting me read it to him because it actually works heaps better as a read aloud, and I think that's probably it. Like, very, very humorous and warm characters, very cheeky sense of humour, but just beautiful rhythm of language. Much like Winnie the Pooh, it has a very similar feel to it. That sort of, and in fact, the Muddle-Headed Wombat is a bit like Winnie the Pooh in the sense of he's sort of lovable and a little bit dumb. And yeah, just that beautiful, absolutely poetic rhythm of speech that, yeah.
There is something, I don't know whether it's overthinking it to talk about the oral tradition and the storytelling tradition and people like Banjo Patterson and whatever, but in Australia we have such a strong heritage of people who fall into that category. I mean, I have my own small child now, and I went out very quickly to make sure we had a copy of The Muddle-Headed Wombat and Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, and you know, these Australian classics survive for a reason. And it is, I think you're right, read out loud, the rhythm of them and the kind of beauty of the storytelling. They're also not afraid to go to quite dark places. I'm thinking more of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie there, which still terrifies me. Can't walk past a Banksia tree, let me tell you. But it is that respect for younger readers as well, that understanding of what it is that any of us look for when we look for a good story.
Yeah, well, actually, I looked up the Wikipedia article for the film adaptation of Playing Beattie Bow the other night when I watched it, you know, just to try and pick up some useful trivia, and it mentioned that it has a PG rating instead of, and the article seemed surprised about this and said it's probably because Abigail says shit at the very end before she jumps off a building. And then I watched it and I'm like, well, no, I would imagine it was probably more to do with the violence and the enormous poverty and the prostitutes and the drugging of the prostitutes and maybe some of those things. And so even in that, which is, you know, it is a children's book, you know, she definitely doesn't shy away from what adults would patronisingly call adult themes.
The chapters in Muddle-Headed Wombat where he becomes a gangland killer, for example, are very disturbing. Very disturbing stuff. I think there's also something to be said about the fact that she wrote radio plays, and that was the origin of Muddle-Headed Wombat, was she was commissioned to write a serial for ABC Children's Session. And it was originally called The Wide Awake Bunyip until some rather drastic last-minute rewrites.
Because the bunyip died.
Which is a good thing. Not that he died, obviously. But it is that writing for audience in that way, writing for radio, the kind of the same discipline that I think made Harp in the South translate so well to the screen. She wrote like a dramatist.
Yes.
And also like a journalist, because her background was in journalism. And one of the things, another of the many things I didn't know about her, was that she was the first woman to be on the newsroom floor in New Zealand. And there's a lovely passage in Fence Around the Cuckoo where she talks about how, you know, that there have been many women who came after her, and she's really, really glad that now there are women, and now that women don't get paid something ridiculous like a sixth of the amount that the men were getting paid. And she's like, but I just want everyone to remember that that's my blood on the floor. But but yeah, I think that journalistic tradition is often a good foreground for writers because it teaches brevity and succinctness, and so I think there is a lot of that in there as well, of trying to communicate complex ideas in simple ways, or deceptively simple ways.
It's interesting just flicking through Harp in the last few days how much of the dialogue was lifted straight from the book. The first person dialogue is just straight from the setting might be different, there might be scenes cut, but the actual dialogue was Ruth Park's dialogue, and that's...
This is my last scan of... Oh, there's a hand. Excellent.
Hi. I was wondering whether you thought Ruth hadn't received enough acknowledgement as a comic writer. She has lots of fabulous one-liners that are very witty, particularly in Beattie Bow, and due to the success of her other more serious works, do you think perhaps that's been overlooked?
That's a really interesting point. I think all of her books are fantastically humorous, and that's one of the things that makes them so accessible. But yeah, I wonder if, again, it's much like the fact that we're, the Australian literary, big wigs are not particularly excited about books set in cities or books set in the domestic realm. We're also not a big fan of giving kudos to books that are funny. Humour is not a prized literary trait.
It's not artistic, it's very lowbrow to be funny, as I've learned to my peril.
And yet it is so difficult. Good humour. I know from playwrights, you get a funny play, whether you like the play or not, to actually have a theatre full of people roaring with laughter is one of the most difficult things to do. And Ruth does it beautifully with just, as you said, throwaway lines. Again, just, catching up with that lovely moment towards the end of Harp where Mr. Diamond, who's, a Northern Orangeman, decides he's going to convert to Catholicism to please Huey and Mumma, and they just turn on him. Orangemen don't become Catholics. And it's just that throwaway thing of, but it is very, especially when you, sort of grew up as a Catholic with orange neighbours. And, it's those little things that and that to me is good writing. It's, again, I go back to Jimmy McGovern, Alan Bennett, those people, life, no matter how awful, is often humorous. And really good writers capture all of that, and all of that is humour as well as the drama. And I think Ruth captures it beautifully. But you're right, it's not something that's appreciated by some people who think they know what they're talking about.
I so wish we had placards made up saying, "Remember Ruth Park," and we could storm the Miles Franklin dinner. It would seriously make waves in a very small sector.
Walk past with our books.
Honestly, I've got a swipe card that'll let you into the building. So come to me afterwards if you want it. I think the other thing about humour in Park is she didn't have her comic novels and her dramatic ones. She integrated those two streams in her writing flawlessly, and that's part of
real life.
Yeah. I thought we might give her the last words of the session. She said, "The world is full of novels in which characters simply say and do. There are certainly legitimate genres in which this is sufficient, but in real and lasting writing, the character is." I'm going to go and reread Ruth Park now off the back of the session, but I'd ask you to join me in thanking Lili Wilkinson and Anne Phelan.
Thank you very much.